Hey, everybody, this is Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. There's a lot of interesting things happening in Latin America at the moment, and today we have with us a very special guest, Senor Pablo Rueda. He's speaking to us from Punta del Este in Uruguay. He's an Argentine who has emigrated to Uruguay. He's a lawyer and has been an activist in his life and a very keen man of the ocean, tries to bodyboard every single day, and has a very interesting and insightful series of views on politics in the region, and we'll be talking to him regularly. Today, we just want to talk about two things: the recent votes, which are ongoing in neighboring Argentina, and the position of the current president, Javier Milei, followed by a discussion of a sad loss that happened last week with the death of Jose Pepe Mujica, the former president of Uruguay. So, first of all, let me welcome you, Pablo, to Democracy Tomorrow. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you, Scott. Very happy to be here on a Sunday morning at 8 a.m., rainy day, finishing my breakfast, trying to finish my breakfast.
Well, we appreciate your incredible dedication. Now, so tell us what's happening next door in Argentina. I know there's local elections going on in Buenos Aires today, and there's been earlier provincial and local elections in other parts of the country with more to come. What outcome is expected for these elections, and how will it impact on the current and very controversial administration of Mr. Milei?
Yes. Every 2 years, Congress representatives are renewed in certain percentages, not all the Congress, not all the representatives. And this is happening this year in all provinces of Argentina, including the city of Buenos Aires that works as a province in political structure. Today is an election in the city of Buenos Aires, and as it was when Milei won the presidency, the political sectors are divided in three: Peronist, Milei, and Cambiemos, which was an alliance that no longer exists. So what is happening is that Cambiemos in these elections has 4 candidates. So it's divided by 4. So that means that that alliance does not exist anymore, and that no one in that alliance will win the election. The vote will be divided.
There will be results from basically 5 major parties instead of 3 political entities.
Exactly. So the vote will be divided. The winner will be or the Peronist or Milei. It cannot be Cambiemos because Cambiemos is all divided. So what is expected is that the Peronists will win. But they will win, and this is very important, with the same or less vote than previous elections. So that success, it's not so relevant because they are not gaining votes. It's just that Milei is coming far from behind and is winning a lot of votes. Probably Milei will be second in the election, highly probable, taking votes from Cambiemos. And the Peronists will win only because they have those votes from the past.
Right. So just to clarify for people that don't know what a Peronist is, I mean, this is the political party that was started by strongman leader, but left-wing leader, Juan Perón and his famous wife, Evita Perón, back in the 1940s? Was it? 50s?
Yes, in 1943.
43. And they remain a powerful force. The previous government was Peronist, I believe, that was ousted by Milei, and they would stand on the left side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, the left fascist side of the spectrum.
Right.
So
right.
there's a lot to say about the left side and the fascist side of the Peronists, no?
Absolutely. And then the Cambiemos, the the three-party coalition you mentioned would more or less occupy the center region, center-left, center, and center-right, and then Milei would occupy the hard right or extreme right.
Exactly.
Well, maybe in another episode we talk about how the Peronist movement sort of evolved in various directions. We at Democracy Tomorrow love people in every country, and we love people everywhere, and we love every country. But it's important to point out that the history of Argentina is extraordinary in so many ways, and one of the most important that very few people realize is that for a long period of time, Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries on earth, and particularly at the beginning stages of the 20th century, in the early 1900s. I believe at a certain point it was the third or fourth richest country on earth, and it most certainly, unfortunately, is not that today. In fact, I looked up the numbers the other day, and the median net worth of the average Argentine now hovers around, depending on which models you look at, around $4,000 US.
And the GDP of Argentina in 1910 was half of all Latin America. And in 1970, the GDP of Argentina was the same as Brazil.
Wow, with a much smaller population. What about now?
And now it's 1/5 of Brazil.
1/5, wow, yeah. So this is a country that has had its golden age, and maybe one day it will come again. But all of these forces have been.
But I don't agree with that principle that is very much thought in Argentina, because if we try to be what we cannot be anymore, because that was a circumstance of the history of the world. We have another world today. We have to be better than today. That's enough.
The extraordinary thing for people who are not familiar with Latin America or Argentina in particular is this is really a country which has had its severe ups and downs. It is not just bumbling along a little bit up, a little bit down. This has been really up and then really down. And not to forget also, ladies and gentlemen, that from 1976 until 1983, it was under the rule of a brutal military dictatorship, which sort of almost made the word famous, disappearances. And the government of Argentina at that time, military, disappeared. I don't know what the total number it was in the end, 30,000 people or something like that were never found again.
The number is very much discussed. And I can give you another data, which I'm not completely sure, but I was told from a reliable source that Uruguay in per capita has more disappeared than Argentina.
That is true. Yeah, I know that for a fact too. That's definitely true. Smaller number, but per capita, yeah. So the next door neighbor, Uruguay, who we'll talk about in a minute, per capita did worse. But during that period of time, it was a brutal period, the late 60s and early 70s for the Southern Cone. I mean, the same thing happened, of course, in neighboring Chile when, Augusto Pinochet pulled off yet another military coup on September 11th, the first famous September 11th, 1973, with the backing of the United States CIA, which led to the overthrow of democratically elected Social Democrat Allende, and who I believe killed himself inside the presidential palace as the troops from Pinochet were approaching. And they had power in Chile from 73 to 91, I believe. So this was a really very rough period. And I know personally many people who were directly affected and family members of those who were disappeared. And this whole process of disappearance where they would just pull people off the street, which is unfortunately something that still happens in certain countries in the world, never to be seen again. Never to be seen again. There was no report. There was no information given to families. In many regards, they still don't know what happened. A movement started in Argentina called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who used to wear white scarves and who were the mothers of the missing and the disappeared. And one of the tactics or strategies they used was they would put 6 or 8 political prisoners into a helicopter and take off from the barracks and go over the ocean 10 or 20, 30 miles out and literally drop the prisoners living into the ocean and in a plane as well as a helicopter.
Also, Argentina is one of the few or the only country in the history that, following democratic government, was able to judge the militaries in that period, and in a trial that was much more following the law than Nuremberg.
Yes, that's right. And they published a famous book called Nunca Más, Never Again.
Mm-hmm.
And that terminology of nunca más is now used globally to refer to not just the horrible period that Argentina went through then, but all sorts of former dictatorships. And there's a great movie with is Ricardo Darin in that movie? I think he is.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
1985. Yeah,
He's
he's
the
like
prosecutor.
last year. I think that was made. Excellent movie, going in the detail about how these trials took place, and there was no guarantee these trials were going to take place. It was a real struggle to get it to happen. But in fact, just so viewers know, it was as a result of that period that I met you. In fact, Pablito, in Utrecht, in Holland, in 1985 or 1986 or thereabouts. And you were like riding that wave of we are now a democracy, and human rights really matter. And so we worked for the same human rights organization actually in the Netherlands in the mid 80s. And that was also just such a fascinating time, because it was Latin America was getting better, and dictatorships were falling. I mean, it also fell next door in Brazil. 1984 only, right? It was 64 to 84 they had their dictatorship. And progressive governments were being elected, pro-human rights governments were being elected. And then that was right before the whole fall, a few years later, of the Berlin Wall. So it was kind of this whole 10, 15-year period of like increasingly good events were happening. The end of apartheid happened in South Africa, and the end of the Cold War happened, and it was a sort of an unleashing of all these really positive human rights forces across the world, And now clearly we're in a very different era, but we'll talk about that another day. But just to wrap up what the Argentine part of today's discussion. So we have all these elections going on. Javier Milei is known quite extensively at the international level as being, one of the poster children of the extreme right. He seems to be best friends with Donald Trump and a number of other very far right leaders.
Who is a Peronist?
Huh? He's a Peronist?
Donald Trump is an absolute Peronist.
Donald Trump. Okay, well, yeah. Then the Peronist is friends with the Mileiist.
Well, there you see the relation between the left fascist system, no? Because you can have a so-called liberal that his idol and close friend is someone that is imposing protectionist and tariffs and nothing to do with his ideas.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And that's worth exploring later, because a lot of people wouldn't make that link. But I just wanted to mention briefly that people probably saw Elon Musk, the world's richest man, going on stage at some deeply conservative event, maybe even the one where he did the Nazi salute. I can't remember. Anyway, he was emulating Milei and his famous chainsaw, and the whole Doge ministry in the United States that's designed to devastate the various departments of the U.S. government is inspired greatly by Milei and what Milei is attempting to do in Argentina. So Milei has been in power now about 2 years, I believe, and has cut public expenditure massively. And when he took power, inflation was truly out of control. There were all sorts of things at the economic level which were not doing very well. And he instituted a whole series of budget cuts and other, draconian regulations, which led to a massive growth in the poverty level. I think it went up all the way to like 58% of the population was classified.
But it went down.
It went down now. It did go down now, but
it's not.
Many places it was very high.
It's not so. The effects of the attack against inflation by the Milei government weren't so hard as how hard we were before, no? So it didn't change much.
Well, inflation did go down considerably, and the economic situation is more stable. But there is also a lot of social opposition to Milei, and various interest groups obviously suffered as a result. He shut down certain ministries, he shut down certain commissions. He has an adversarial relationship with many sectors in society. But surprisingly to many, I believe, his popularity level in the country remains pretty solid, right?
Yeah. And talking about the election today, he will be probably being second, the winner, because he will be the one winning more votes than the rest. Which also, it has to be said, doesn't make in any manner this political situation of Argentina sustainable in the long term, because there is nothing that is showing that Argentina will have an alternate opposition and government in the future that will continue some of these policies of fiscal stability, which is not far right. It's what Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, they all do that. They don't have high inflation. This is what should be done in the long term in Argentina, the same as the rest of the country. And this position of being the only one, Milei, that can do that, and that the rest are crooks and destroying all the position, makes it unviable, the sustainability of the model in the long term.
Mm.
So
and so you think when this round of voting is over, because it's kind of spread all across the country at municipal and provincial levels, it takes a while. How's Milei's position going to be?
I think he's going to be stronger. At least in this mid-election, he will become stronger politically. Yes.
And do you have any predictions for like in 2 years when they do the next round of these elections, or when the national elections are for Milei? Will he win the next national election? Or do you think
I have no idea. And if you are serious in Argentina, nobody can predict, because Argentina is a pendulum. So if you project Argentine history into Milei's future, he will fail. He will have a crisis and he will fail. I hope not. I hope there is the ideal would be that there's a normal opposition that will take certain good things about Milei, like the fiscal equilibrium and the need to keep low inflation, and take all the rest out. But that normally, if you see the history of Argentina, you see always a pendulum. When you go far to one side, you go back far to the other. So
right. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out, because his political position on the political right wing of things is very different from neighboring Brazil, which is controlled by the PT, the left-wing party of Lula, or Chile, which is also governed by a progressive left-wing government, and the center-left government, where you're sitting now, recently elected a new president or prime minister, president, I think, right? President Orsi, who replaced center-right President Pau. And I guess one time when we were talking about politics recently in Uruguay, you mentioned that basically nothing really changed. It's just a little teeny tinkering of the the details, but basically it remains stable. And Uruguay, the population is only, what is it, 3.5 million now? It's a very small country, very stable country. They call it the Switzerland of Latin America, lowest crime rate, probably highest net wealth per capita. Has a lot of things going for it. Earlier this week, former President Jose Pepe Mujica passed away into the ether. And, he was known as the world's poorest president, the man that lived out on a little farm on the outskirts of Montevideo, drove a very old VW car, donated much of his presidential salary to some social cause. And he governed during the, I think, 5 years that was he president for 5 years or 7 years?
5 years. In Uruguay,
5
it's
years.
5 years.
Yeah. Tremendously popular, and he expanded the protection of human rights in the country. And that's just another important point to point out. Human rights never come automatically. They don't just appear. Human rights are always the result of some sort of struggle. Mujica spent 12 years behind bars as a political prisoner during the bad years, was tortured, was subjected to brutal indignities, and rose to become president later, completely modest living man. And during his term, abortion was decriminalized in Uruguay for the first time, which was quite a forward step in Latin America. Marriage equality was passed, and cannabis consumption was legalized. So, those three things and many others are part of his enduring legacy in a country which is already very forward stepping. It's very much like the Netherlands for Latin America. It tries things out first. And if it works, they stick with it. If it doesn't work, they get rid of it. But maybe you can just share any thoughts you have about Pepe Mujica.
Okay. What is important about Pepe? Pepe Mujica was a terrorist of one of the most brutal terrorist organizations at the beginning in the 60s, and then it went out to the 70s. But the Tupamaros was very strong, very brutal, and was one of the first really organized post-Cuban Revolution terrorist organizations.
I mean, a lot of people would call him a revolutionary before they would call him a terrorist.
Well, let's talk about that. They didn't fight against a dictatorship. They fought against a democracy, and they were able to make that democracy a dictatorship, but they had already lost when the dictatorship took over in Uruguay. They initially fought against a democracy. And what is important about Pepe is he represents to the people a constructor of the present of Uruguay, a present in which there is real democracy and in which political parties construct over what was already constructed by the opposition in the past. And this is the success of Uruguay today. It's a political system that you don't find nowhere in Latin America, and it's very difficult to find in the world. The kind of mature coordination between opposition parties and their agreement to say certain basic conditions in which the country must be aligned. And that is working today in Uruguay, thanks, importantly, to Pepe Mujica. And I stress the fact that he was a terrorist in the past, because that makes Pepe more valuable than if not. Because this is a person that in his youth wanted to change the world through arms and was able to realize that the real construction is with dialogue and acceptance of difference and workings with those who are different, who think different to you, in order to get certain main alignments that are able to benefit all. And the fact that Pepe pushed a lot in favor of that system makes what Uruguay is today.
So there's an acceptance of a certain structural system that everybody knows they must stay within, right? There's a boundary which you cannot cross. Whether you're extreme right wing or extreme left wing or center, there's an acceptable level of space in which you can operate, but beyond that is no longer the democratic system. It's something else. And Pepe assisted to bringing that in. I don't know. I mean, the word terrorist is so emotive, right? To so many people. I mean, they used to call the white South Africans called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, right?
Well, in my words, terrorist is anyone trying to impose their ideas through violence. And there I include the independence of America was done by terrorists. The French Revolution was done by terrorists. It's what people call terrorists today. Probably the people in Gaza that they call terrorists, well, they are fighting for something.
When I was studying human rights back in the early 1980s, I had this Swiss professor. He was a very peaceful, very gentle guy, worked for the Red Cross, and he came onto the lectern, and the first thing he said to this human rights class was all about, human rights law and how to apply the law and stuff. And he said, the most important thing you can remember when you study human rights and work in the field of human rights is that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? And so I think it's important to remember that, because that term really now especially is used to justify any sort of action against the so-called terrorist, right? So notwithstanding the cause, notwithstanding the methods, notwithstanding any other issue, it should never be needed, right? It should never be needed by anybody that they think they need to resort to violence. And the way that you get beyond that is you have a system of the rule of law grounded so deeply in human rights that nothing of that even enters one's mind. I mean, that's really got to be the objective, right? And so,
but also there is a part in the freedom fighters, when you call them freedom fighters, that misses the point that they are taking arms to fight for their ideas. And freedom fighters seems to justify that. And in my opinion, I am like Gandhi, man. If you
so am I. So am
if
I.
you want to defend your ideas, do whatever, but don't take the arms. You know who has an answer to this debate? Who has a good answer to this debate? Pepe Mujica. Pepe Mujica. Because Pepe Mujica was a freedom fighter, and he many times reviewed his position as freedom fighter dash terrorist. And he's very critic about what he did in those times. Very critical. Particularly in a country that had a democracy and had a per capita income that was very good. Terrorist freedom fighters of Argentina in the 70s, who also fought many times against a democracy, also to dictatorships, true, but also to democracies. As I told you before, at that time Argentina had the GDP of Brazil.
Oh, and lest we forget, none other than Che Guevara, the quintessential armed revolutionary, freedom fighter / terrorist / willing to kill for freedom, of course, is an Argentine who grew up in Buenos Aires and then traveled the world to discuss his beliefs with many people and ended up in Cuba and all the rest. But let's end on a positive note that somebody like Pepe Mujica, realized the errors of some of his ways as a young man and, paid the price.
Never about his ideas, Scott, eh?
His actions, let's say, his actions.
His actions. Never about his ideas.
And became known as the incorruptible, very simple living president that I certainly personally admire greatly. And to see somebody who completely transcended the trappings of power and really did try his best to achieve what he could to make Uruguay a better place for the average person.
Absolutely.
And so, with that, let's remember him fondly. He lived 89 years. He just died a few days ago, I think, and will be buried next to his favorite dog, I believe, on his little farm. So here's to you, Pepe Mujica. And any other last words today, Pablo? Let's have a drink to Pepe. I'll have one too.
A drink to Pepe.
Any last words? What do you think is going to happen in the election today? Anything exciting? Any special results?
No, I don't think so. I think it will be a lot of noise. Everybody will try to show that they won, and nothing really significant will happen.
Right.
Milei has lowered inflation, which is good, but now we are in an idle mode. We are like this, and still it's uncertain what will happen to Argentina.
Well, everybody will eat some sort of meat probably today. Some people will eat dulce de leche for dessert. Everybody will dance the tango. So
Absolutely.
thank you very much, Pablo, for visiting with us today on Democracy Tomorrow. And we'll be back tomorrow with more news from around the world about democracy and the future of our planet, the one we all share. Thanks for watching, everybody, and see you again soon.